Welcome, everyone, to our virtual workshop here with Scott Labs and Yonder Cider, hosted by the Northwest Cider Association. I'm so excited to hear about ways to enhance culinary apple juice to make cider. And I want to welcome our speakers, Ella Beck, who's the marketing manager at Scott Labs, Monique Tribble, who's the head cider maker at Yonder, and Arturo Aguirre, cider maker at Yonder in Wenatchee, Washington. They are here to present some really cool collaborations they've made and encourage you all to ask questions in the chat. Or if you are watching this in a recorded version, feel free to email the speakers. I'll hand it over.
Thank you. And again, yes, I am Ella Beck. I'm the marketing manager for Scott Laboratories. I am standing in for Dr. Nicola Hall, who is more familiar than I am in the cider community. She's been an instructor for CINA for a long time, but we've worked really closely on this presentation. So let's see here. So this is just an overview of where we're going today. I'm going to give both myself and Yonder a chance to introduce themselves. I'm going to have Yonder cover what quote unquote less interesting bases are. That's what we've called sort of culinary apples and concentrate in the promotion of this webinar. I'm going to let them cover what they are and then what sort of sensory challenges they can present. And then we're going to work together to talk about tools for adding complexity to these quote unquote less interesting bases. So I'm going to discuss how categories of things work broadly speaking, and then Yonder will cover some product trials that they've done and share sensory impact and potential applications. And I really want to highlight, this is not to promote any one product that we discussed today. There are many suppliers out there that make a lot of the stuff that we make. So all we hope is that you learn something new and you take away some new ideas. So for Scott Laboratories, you might be familiar with us from our cider handbooks. But if you don't, we are a supplier for the wine, cider, and specialty beverage industry, though most of our experience and business is in wine and cider. And while our experience is rooted in wine, we've been involved in cider for the past 15 years, both publishing a cider-specific catalog, which you may have some of these or all of these. And then we've supported cider research both here in the US at Virginia Tech, as well as abroad. And if you're unfamiliar with our portfolio, we specialize in fermentation, stability, and finishing products, as well as filtration. But we also support the cider market with oak and cork and wire hoods. So I'll let Yonder introduce themselves.
All right, I'm Monique. Hi, everybody. Just a few points here to tell you a little bit about Yonder. We were founded in 2020 in Washington State, and we are about to have our 4th anniversary, which is crazy. A lot has happened in these few short years, and we've grown a lot. Our production is based in Wenatchee, Washington. We press apples on site. We press culinary fruit. We also press cider-specific fruit that we source all over the Pacific Northwest. But being in Wenatchee is it's great. We're right in the heart of it, which it makes a lot of sense for us. We are on track. We are projected to press roughly 5 million pounds in 2024, which is mind-blowing, but it's real, it's happening, and here we go. One thing about Yonder, I feel very true. I feel like this is very true to Yonder. We aim to create something that is for the seasoned cider drink, but also something that's approachable for somebody that has no idea about cider, somebody that is a non-cider drinker. We have some cocktail-inspired ciders. We love experimenting with unique flavors, and we aim to blur the line between modern and traditional ciders. We're making anything from traditional perries, to barrel-aged single varietals and fruited and infused products. And we've got quite the footprint in Washington State, collaborating with some really notable beverage companies in the region, which I feel like they really continue to push us forward and surprise people about cider. So that's Yonder.
So I'm going to let Yonder keep talking about sort of defining what those quote unquote less interesting bases are.
Yeah, I'm Arturo, cider maker for Yonder as well. So, I mean, we all know cider apples are great. They make wonderful ciders, but they're not that many, right? They're very scarce. They're very expensive. So most ciders are made with culinary apples, your regular dessert apples, what you see in the supermarket, like those exact varieties. These are your Honeycrisps, your Gala, Red Delicious, etc. And they're all different, right? They're all apples, but I mean, you probably have a favorite apple, right? You like the one that is like more tart or the ones that's more sweet. So they all have different characteristics, and picking and choosing these characteristics is kind of the key to making a balanced cider. For example, our own style is a more sharper, more tart, high in acidity base. That's because it works well with our profiles. But some people might be looking for something a little bit more mellow, a little bit less acidic because it works well with what they're looking for. So it will depend the style that you're looking for, your other fruits or botanicals or other flavors that you want to use in. So you can pick and choose from all these available apples to make something that's truly yours. Yeah, but the problems with that is that apples, there's natural variation, obviously. Sometimes apples, the same variety of apples are going to be different. The acidity is going to be different. The yield, sweetness, it's all going to be different. There's also fluctuations in supply. Like maybe you use a lot of Honeycrisps and then you cannot find them anymore. Maybe you lose a lot of Sweet Tangos, Red Delicious, and you cannot find them anymore. So you need to tweak, you need to use other apples. It also depends on the season, right? We are used to seeing apples year round in the supermarket, and we do press year round, but all of those apples are harvested within a window of time and then they are stored in controlled atmosphere rooms and other technology that I don't really know about. And then we get them year round. So we see that towards the end of the season, before the new harvest, these apples definitely are a little bit old, a little bit tired. Flavors are not as bright. They're a little bit boring. But that's what we have, and that's what we have to work with. So it's challenging to maintain a constant, high quality base. Sometimes the aroma is going to be low. Sometimes the palate's going to be thin. Sometimes it's just going to be different to what you need to work with your products. This is particularly important for people who can't press their own apples. They're too small, or a press is a big investment. When you're buying juice, sometimes you're limited to what you can access. So if you're big enough and you can get a juicer or an orchard to give you a specific blend of apples, that's great, but they also have the problems of they might not have what you want. But the good news is that you can correct these shortcomings. You can drive the style while using certain fermentation and post-fermentation ingredients. So you can get what you have and drive it to where you want it to be. Yeah.
Thank you. So now we're going to jump into what is going to be most of the presentation, which is where we're going to cover tools for adding complexity. And we're going to sort of go in order of when you might use them in the cider making process. So I'm going to start off by introducing non-Saccharomyces yeast. So non-Sac yeast are yeast outside of the Saccharomyces genus, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae are typically what we use for alcoholic fermentation. And we hear a lot about non-Sac yeast when it comes to natural beverage production. We hear about they're part of the native microflora, they add complexity, etc. But ambient non-Sac species are not always super predictable. So sometimes they can be really good. They can add a lot of complexity, a lot of really interesting things. Sometimes they can be super funky, or they can produce a ton of VA. So just like the research and development that led to the production of reliable Saccharomyces strains, that has happened in the last several years with non-Saccharomyces strains. So we've developed predictable and reliable non-Sac strains. And what's interesting about non-Sac is they're generally not very fermentative. They'll produce a little bit of alcohol, but they're not able to always complete the full fermentation. But that being said, they can have really cool features, including antimicrobials. So depending on the strain, they can outcompete spoilage microorganisms. They can provide some antioxidation protection. So some of them can consume large amounts of oxygen, which is super helpful when thawing juice, transporting juice, settling juice, clarifying juice, etc. Some of them have an acid metabolism, so they can actually produce lactic acid from glucose. And then for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on those that have the ability to enhance aroma and mouthfeel. And the way that you generally use non-sac yeast is you add them a few days prior to inoculating with a Saccharomyces strain that's then going to complete your alcoholic fermentation. So I'm going to talk about how they enhance mouthfeel and aroma. And so we'll start off with aroma. And it's important to note that Saccharomyces and non-Saccharomyces yeast can impact cider aroma in similar ways. So they both can produce esters. And so you'll see here on the left is the diagram of ester production. So the primary metabolism of yeast is, of course, producing alcohol from sugar. But they can produce these metabolic byproducts that are aroma compounds called esters that are fruity, floral, and spicy, depending on the strain, as well as what you're fermenting. And then the other main pathway is the enzymatic release of terpenes from sugar. So terpenes are naturally occurring aroma compounds from apples. And so when you press apples, they're released into the juice, and many of them are released into the juice in this bound form. So you can see it's bound to a sugar molecule. And in that bound form, we can't smell them. So yeast can produce an enzyme called beta glucosidase. And what it does is it cleaves that terpene from the glucose molecule, and then the terpene is now free and we can smell it. So it enhances and increases that varietal aroma, which you often hear talked about with yeast strains, like this yeast strain enhances varietal aroma. And the ability to do this in both non-sac and Saccharomyces yeast strains is totally strain dependent. But on the whole, non-sac yeast can do this better. And it's not to say that non-sac yeast always do these things better. It's just that they have the capacity to do them better when they've been isolated and selected as the right strain for this. Something similar with mouthfeel. So you'll see I've modified my favorite diagram. It's going to recur throughout the presentation. And this is similar. So Saccharomyces and non-Saccharomyces yeast can impact cider mouthfeel in similar ways. So it's also sort of a metabolic byproduct of the primary fermentation. So for lack of a better visual, I used a picture of velvet and of maple syrup to sort of indicate that like roundness, softness of mouthfeel that is given by these secondary metabolic byproducts. And I wanted to put this giant red asterisk in here because this picture is somewhat reductive. We'll get into texture a little bit more later. But for these purposes, the compounds that we're talking about are sugar alcohols, which are also called polyols, and then manoproteins. And again, both Saccharomyces and non-Saccharomyces yeast can do this, but non-Sac can often do it much better and more effectively when it's the right strain that has been isolated for that. So I'll jump into the product trial that Yonder did with one of the non-Sac yeast from our portfolio. They worked with Biodiva. Biodiva seems for us to be a pretty popular choice in the cider market. And the two things about Biodiva is it is an overproducer of esters. So it produces quite a lot of those fruity and floral compounds. And then it also produces arabitol, which is a sugar alcohol. And that leads to increased mouthfeel, volume, and roundness. And it's a Tyrolusflora delbrueckii strain. And what's interesting about Biodiva is it is mildly fermentative. So it can produce up to 6% alcohol, which is pretty rare of most non-sac strains. Again, I said they're typically not super fermentative. So I'll turn it over to Yonder to sort of talk about potential applications and their experience with it.
Yeah, we did a trial with Biodiva here at Yonder. Like Ella mentioned, it's a very common technique in wine, particularly, but also in cider to let things just wild ferment for a few days, spontaneously ferment and get a bit of funk and mouthfeel and complexity. But yeah, this I think it's not a great idea because it's hard to replicate. It's hard to predict what's going to happen. But if you can select a known non-sac yeast, then you can get predictable, replicable results. So what we did with Biodiva, we did a side-by-side fermentation, small scale, just a tiny volume. On one of them, the control was just a regular juice using a regular protocol with our normal Saccharomyces yeast. Nothing changed. On the other one, we used the identical juice, but we inoculated with Biodiva at the same time with the other one. And then at about 1/3 of the fermentation, we inoculated with our regular yeast. So we didn't let it go all the way, just 1/3, and then with our regular yeast. And what we got, there were very stark differences. So on our control was just light, tropical, a little bit citrus, pineapple. It was a little bit short, a little bit bitter. With Biodiva, even though it was active just for a third of the fermentation, we had a very intense, ripe tropical fruit, like a lot of mango, a little baking spice. It reminded me of like a fruit tart. The mouthfeel was so different. It was way thicker, viscous. It would just coat the tongue and the whole mouth. The finish was super long. So even at 1/3, it had a great impact. So applications for this is that it can supplement like culinary apple bases when the palate is too thin or the aroma seems to be muted and boring. It more importantly, it provides weight and complexity to some of like low ABV ciders that tend to be really thin, and other types of ciders like cider cane. Um, and the cool thing is that biodive in particular, like Ella said, it can ferment up to 6%. So you can inoculate with your regular yeast at 1/3 or a half, or you can even just let it completely ferment with biodiva, and then you can modulate how much you want of that effect. So it's important to say that it changes the character profoundly. Like I said, we went from light tropical and citrus to really ripe tropical. So it's going to change the style. So you need to decide how much you want to incorporate into your product as a supplemental, yeast, and not really, oh, I'm just going to use Biodiva for everything, because it's going to be different. That's up to you to decide. But yeah, it can really have a huge impact on mouthfeel specifically, and just getting in other aromas in there that you wouldn't see normally on your cider base, your normal cider base.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're gonna move on to talking about another tool, which is enzymes. And enzymes that have been prepared for beverage applications, I'm gonna refer to them as enological enzymes, not to be confused with enzymes that like yeast can produce. But enological enzymes, they can do two main things. So they break down pectin and structural polysaccharides. Apples are full of pectin. And what this does is it both releases desirable compounds, so juice presses out more easily, aroma compounds are more easily extracted from skins, and it prevents processing issues. So pectin can cause filtration, clarification, and haze issues. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're actually going to focus on another thing that enological enzymes can do, which is releasing sugar-bound aromas. And we'll talk about how they do that. So you've seen this picture before. And the yeast and enological enzymes can both affect aroma in the same general way, but there are some slight differences. So the enzymes that yeast produce can cleave those terpenes from glucose. But glucose isn't the only sugar in cider. There are tons of non-fermentable sugars in cider, like arabinose, rhamnose, and xylose, which are just sugars with different amounts of carbon. And these can still bind terpenes. So yeast can release terpenes while glucose is still around, but when fermentation is done, those enzymes that yeast have produced are not super helpful anymore. And so that's where, depending on formulation, enological enzymes can come in. So they can actually do this post-fermentation, giving you some tools to work with if you're getting close to like finishing and packaging. And so just to highlight those differences again, the yeast are most effective on glucose. They produce beta-glucosidase. And then enological enzymes, they produce beta-glycosidases. So that is the indication that they can cleave terpenes from other sugars as well as glucose. So the product that from our portfolio that Yonder worked with was Rapidase Revelation Aroma. It's really specifically targeted towards post-fermentation use, releasing those glycosylated terpenes, those terpenes that are bound to non-fermentable sugars to increase fruity and floral aromas. So again, giving you a tool to work with after fermentation if you've realized like, oh, I didn't, intervene in the ways I wanted to in fermentation.
All right, so we used we went through our normal protocol for fermentation, same as above. I would say the control is just like our typical high acid base, which was very, citrus forward, some tropical notes that are pretty subtle, a pretty short finish, kind of a thin palate, but a very buildable base, which is usually what we're going for. When we added the Rapidase Revelation aroma, the citrus forwardness kind of rounded out, and you started to smell some or detect some aromas that you couldn't before, which was pretty cool. Some floral notes really appeared. We got kind of like a fresh fruit salad, and again, some subtle tropical notes. Didn't really impact mouthfeel or flavor, but it was pretty cool to see all of these other aromas emerging. The citrus forwardness didn't disappear, but it was packed in there with a lot of other things. So application, or the biggest takeaway I would say is it doesn't change your cider, but it definitely drives it in a direction, unlocking a diversity of aromas. Um, Another thing about this is you can allow this enzyme to remain in contact with your product until desired levels of aromatic compounds are achieved. So we actually did we have 3 different tastings that we did. We have 1 more to do. And so it'd be nice to see, like, after the first tasting, how it has impacted the bottles that we've saved. So we might have some more info to report back.
Yeah, actually, thank you for touching on that. I was gonna add that because I forgot to mention it. So yeah, enzymes keep working until inactivated, and they're inactivated with a little bit of bentonite. But you can really customize how far you want this to go. So that's kind of a nice feature of some of these things.
Ella, there's a couple of
Um,
questions. Can I relay them to the?
yeah, please.
So back for the first product, there was a question about SO2. When did you use that? Was it just used as normal in pre-inoculation?
For the Biodiva.
We don't use SO2 pre-fermentation, and I believe the Biodiva does have a maximum of SO2 it can tolerate. Ella would know better about that.
Yeah, it does have a printed maximum. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it is tolerant to a little bit of SO2.
Yeah, we usually don't add SO2 pre-fermentation, so that was not a problem. We just add SO2 when it's done post-fermentation.
And then I believe this question was for this Rapidase. Did you change the dosages of yeast? This is from Mark. Or was it full first yeast strain dosage and same for second strain doubled yeast?
Yeah, we didn't change the yeast addition at all.
Yeah, that's also for Biodiva. Yeah, we use like the full dose of both of them. I believe it's around 25 grams per hectoliter that we use for both of them. That's the recommended dosing. Yeah.
Then there's another question from James. Is the bitterness on the finish from Rapidase a desirable feature or one to be minimized?
I thought it was desirable, but I also think, like, run trials with this. I mean, figure out where you want it to land. But no, it was very pleasant, and something that we kind of want in our product.
Okay, another question. This one's from Peter. If enzymes cleave sugars, do those sugars become fermentable?
No, they do not. They remain unfermentable.
Okay. Anna wants to know, was the Rapidase Revelation aroma trial used only on culinary apple batches? What types of apples?
Yes, we only used it on culinary apples. I think this blend had honeys, grannies, some Fuji, Cosmic.
Cosmic. Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint which apples because, like I mentioned, we change a lot our ratio of apples depending on what's available.
Yeah.
And then they get fermented, they get blended, they get filtered, blended again. So it's hard to say at this point, which apples were there in particular, but it can be any of the varieties of culinaries. Yeah.
Those 4 for sure. Probably those 4 were probably the primary, but yeah, like you said, it changes.
And one more question. This one's from Gabriel about the remaining sugars. Do they provide any residual sweetness?
No, so non-fermentable sugars do not particularly enhance sweetness, but the only number it would change, like, actually it wouldn't change whether they're bound to terpenes or not. They affect the total sugar number, which really comes into play if you're doing like a nutritional panel. But no, does not play into sensory really at all.
Thanks, everyone.
So we'll jump to tannins. And tannins have tons of potential applications in cider that you can see on the screen. They can be antioxidation protection. They can enhance aroma, structure, they can, well, modulate structure, they can increase volume and roundness, and then sort of as a combination of some of those factors, they can enhance freshness as well. And tannins are phenolic compounds extracted from a variety of plant sources, including grape seeds, oak, other fruit and nut woods. And we don't fully understand exactly how tannins work, but what we do know is that they can complex with compounds in cider, and that affects all of the above, sort of on the screen. And then they can also contribute aroma and texture of their own. So think like a tannin derived from oak that can increase tannin intensity, like as if you were aging in a barrel, and then also add those oak aromas and flavors. So for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on these three sort of abilities here in the middle. So they can enhance aroma, they can add aromas, or through that complexing mechanism that we don't fully understand, they can modulate existing aromas. They can add structure. And so this, again, like I was talking about, oftentimes those ones extracted from oak and those other wood sources are pretty good at doing this. They can increase sort of that like tannin intensity, grippiness, that like, you know, more astringent mouthfeel that you're looking or that you would get from a cider apple. And then they can increase volume and roundness. And this is really through the complexing abilities. So some tannins can increase mouthfeel and the perception of sweetness due to their ability to interact with other molecules like polysaccharides and other tannins. So there's a couple of different considerations to think about when you're choosing a tannin. There's when you should add it. So where are you in the process? And what amount of contact time are you going to need to really get the most from that tannin? And for the purpose of this presentation, we're really focusing on what we call the aging and the finishing tannins. So the aging need about 3 to 6 weeks contact time, and then the finishing tannins need about 48 hours. So depending on where you are in the process, you may have different options available to you. And then what does it do? So what is this tannin positioned to do? What impact may it have on your cider? So Yonder did a trial with 5 of our tannins. 3 of them are on the screen here. There are 3 to 6 week contact time tannins. And then on the next slide, you'll see the 2 finishing tannins, and they can be added 48 hours prior to bottling. So these next couple of slides introducing these products aren't really to give you like any information about them. I'll let Yonder speak to their experience with them. But really what I want to highlight is that tannins can appear super similar in like what they're supposed to do when you add them and what they're derived from. But they can act really, really different once you put them in the cider matrix, because again, so much of what they do is complexing with other things that are already in the cider, which you may know about and you may not know about. So trials are super important when working with tannins, and especially with post-fermentation tannins. You know, a little bit harder to do trials with fermentation tannins because you sort of throw them in during fermentation. But another thing to point out is a tannin that you like in one of your ciders or in somebody else's cider, you may not like in some of your other ciders. So again, super important to do trials. And then, like I said before, these are the finishing tannins. 48 hours contact time, racking is not required. And of course, we are not the only distributor that sells tannins like this, but they can be a really cool tool if you're right before going into packaging, when you need to turn over tanks or you're getting things packaged and out to the market quickly. So Yonder.
Yeah, so we did trials with these tannins. We used also the same base that we use for the Rapidase. So first, I'll touch on the aging tannins. We found that their main impact was on the mouthfeel, the astringency, the finish, a little bit on the aroma, but it was mostly on the palate, on the mouthfeel and all that. So our control was the same. It was just citrusy forward, light tropical, pineapple, slightly bitter, thin. And we tried estate and rich. So what we got with estate is that it did impact a little bit the aroma. It just made it a little bit riper. And we got hints of oak and spice, maybe a little bit dustiness there, which is knowing that it's derived from wood. You can see that where that's coming from. It did give us a way heavier mouthfeel, and most importantly, a very well integrated astringency. It was not bitter at all, but it just had a long finish. It also gave it like a little, it felt a little bit boozy, like higher, like warm, higher percentage of alcohol. With the Rich, it did little change in the aroma, but it was also fuller and rounder with a long finish. But it was still a little bit pithy, a little bit bitter. Definitely more subtle the effect on the Rich than the Estate. So they're both for aging, but they felt very different. So for emulating a cider fruit cider, for example, like bittersweet, bitter sharp style, Estate was great because it gave us that astringency, that tannic feeling that you get from cider apples, but it was very well integrated. It wasn't super grippy or super bitter. It was just very round and well integrated. Now, I will say that do trials because it can be a little bit too much. On the higher rates for Estate, we found that it was like punch you in the face astringency. So sometimes not more is not always better. So definitely do trials of where you want to modulate that astringency. Rich was a lot more subtle. So it did improve the palate. It did give that a little bit of astringency and longer finish without being so obvious out there. So yeah, if you're looking for something that does not scream tannin and astringency, but you just want it to make it more complex and a little bit more diverse, the mouthfeel like Rich is the way to go. So both for aging, but definitely very different styles. So depending on what you're going for. Yeah. And then on the finishing tannins that require no aging, just um, we had impact. The main impact was on aroma intensity and brightness of the cider itself. It did have some improvement in the mouthfeel, some impact, but not as much as the aging one. So our control was the same as before, a little bit citrusy, light tropical. Now on the Onyx, what we found is that it shifted from citrus and a little bit of tropical to mainly bright tropical. Like the amount of pineapple that we got from that was insane. It felt brighter. It felt the mouthfeel was fuller. The palate was rounder. The finish was longer. On Radiance, it also improved the mouthfeel definitely. It increased the finish as well, but this one went the other direction. This one went to the riper tropical mango. Onyx was like bright, fresh tropical, and Radiance was like ripe tropical. It also increased the aroma intensity. The flavor pops in your mouth. It did have a little bit of drying astringency in Radiance that Onyx did not have, but it just improved the mouthfeel overall. So we can definitely see this when being used when we're packaging a cider, and it feels, and we've definitely been there where it just feels muted. It feels that it's lacking something or it's a little bit thin. We can do some on-the-fly trials to see if any of these are going to help with that. Now, it will depend, obviously, on the style of the cider. We saw that both of these work very well, but it will depend on what cider we're using. So if you have a cider, and also depending on the other fruits and botanicals you're using, so if you're going for a certain style, that Onyx might fit better and Radiance might make it disjointed or make it like just weird. So again, do trials to see what works on your cider and whatnot. But this is definitely very useful for, especially just before packaging when there's very little things you can do, right? You cannot wait, you cannot add aging tannins or give it 2 more weeks. It's like we're canning or bottling tomorrow. So this is a great tool to just do on the fly, last minute additions. But again, it depends on what you're going for and depends on what you have, whether it works or not. Um,
Thank you, Arturo. I'm loving these descriptions. I liked especially the punch you in the face astringency. You're keeping us entertained. There was a question left over about Rapidae, maybe more for Ella. Does it work better with cider apples?
So it definitely does have potential applications in cider apples, and I would probably say yes. Like cider apples are known for having more aromatic compounds, more structured compounds, etc. So I would say that yes, it would probably work more effectively in cider fruit. However, I mean, culinary apples also have terpenes, so that's why I wanted to bring it into the conversation here, but definitely could be used in cider apples.
Awesome. Okay, Chris wants to know if packaging a filtered cider, would you add the finishing tannins prior to filtration or post? And then do you see a significant difference between the two?
So typically
Question, I don't know.
I was gonna say our recommendations for adding the finishing tannins are add them after your, I mean, everybody calls it something different, but your pre-filtration. So your depth filtration, your cross flow, etc. Add it right after that, but before you go through a sterile membrane, if that is something that you're doing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's probably where we would add them. We'll start with our filter cider, we'll blend our cider, and then we will determine, oh, it's missing something, and then add it, yeah, post-filtration just before packaging. That's where we would add it.
I don't see any more questions.
Cool. Well, then I'll jump to the last sort of tool category that we're going to talk about today, which is nanoproteins. And I wasn't sure
One more
of
just
the
came
better.
through.
Oh,
Sorry,
yeah.
before we skip on, how does Onyx and Radiance work weeks, months, years?
Oh, like the lasting impact?
Maybe Kevin can clarify.
We can come back to that question maybe after this section.
Sounds great. One more question about tannins from Blaine. Did you find any difference in where you experienced the addition of mouthfeel, like mid palate or tongue?
Can you repeat that? Sorry, I didn't get
Did you
it.
find a difference in where in the mouth you experienced the addition of mouthfeel?
For the addition of the tannins?
For the finishing ones, it did say for which ones?
Said when
I mean,
using tannins.
Yeah, it's different. Like for the aging one, for the estate, it was like an overall astringency and tannic everywhere. The ridge was a little bit more subtle, but still everywhere. It was more feeling in the middle of the palate. The finishing tannins, it was just like a little bit longer finish and a little bit in the middle, but not that. It was mostly on the aromatics. That makes sense if that answers the question.
Yeah, hopefully. And then Kevin, yeah, Blaine said, thank you. Kevin added, his question was about periods of time, any changes in flavor. And he was specifically asking about Onyx and Radiance.
So the finishing tannins being that you add them right prior to packaging and sort of how do they perform after that through the longevity of the product.
That's, yeah.
Yeah, our experience has been that the impact that you get during your trial with them is what remains. But again, it may be something that if you feel uncomfortable with that to trial on a small batch first. Okay, so jumping into manoproteins, I wasn't really sure how to display a comparison of two things, so we ended up with the Drake name. But manoproteins are really similar to gum arabics. So gum arabics they're derived from acacia trees. They've long been used in cider and wine for colloidal stability and texture. And manoproteins are sort of newer to the market, and they are biologically derived. So I hate to say that gum arabic isn't quote unquote natural, but manoproteins are a biologically derived alternative. They're derived from yeast. And so what are manoproteins? We're bringing back my favorite image and my own beautiful artistic renderings. But during fermentation and growth, yeast produce manoproteins in a similar fashion to the ester production. So it's a secondary byproduct of the primary fermentation. And why do they do this? It's because their cell walls contain manoproteins. And the manoproteins in the cell wall are really important for maintaining the structural integrity of the cell during increasingly difficult fermentation conditions. So that would be temperature, increasing alcohol, etc. Now, you really get the benefit of manoproteins after fermentation when the yeast breaks down, explodes, and dies, because then all of the manoproteins from that cell wall are released into the cider. So when we're talking about making manoprotein products for cider, think about enzymes. So yeast make manoproteins, but we can also produce manoproteins for cider making purposes. So we're talking about intentionally growing and autolyzing yeast, and that's how we get manoproteins. And what a manoprotein product does depends on what yeast strain it was produced from, what substrate it was grown in, when in its life cycle it was autolyzed or killed, and then degree of autolysis. So how exploded did they make the cell? Was it fully autolyzed, partially autolyzed, or are you getting purified manoproteins? And I say this not to be confusing or that you need to know all of these parameters about the manoprotein product that you're working with, but just to explain why there's so many different manoprotein products out there and why they all do different things. So what can manoproteins do? Two main things: they contribute to colloidal stability and they enhance texture and aroma. And colloidal stability and what are colloids, etc., that's its own presentation, but I think we're all familiar with colloidal instability, which is hazes, precipitates, filtration issues, etc. And this can happen even without just in like only apple fermentations, but it's really important when you're talking about back sweetening, blending with fruit, blending with wine, or co-fermentation, because you're really adding a lot more colloids to that mixture that can disrupt sort of that harmony. And then what we're going to focus on for the purpose of this presentation is, of course, enhancing texture and aroma. So they manoproteins work sort of like tannins. We don't fully understand what they do. It's totally matrix dependent. And just like tannins, they can both contribute texture on their own, but they can also complex with things in cider to change texture and aroma. So from our portfolio, Yonder worked with 2 of our manoprotein products, and we really focused on ones that you can add, again, right prior to packaging. And those were Final Touch Tonic and Ultima Soft. Final Touch Tonic is purified manoprotein. So they're like fully purified. It's not partially autolyzed. And the purpose of this product is really extending shelf life. And the main impact that we see it have is on aroma. So it can prevent premature aging, preservation of freshness, and preventing of oxidative damage in the package and on the shelf and during transport. And then Ultima Soft is a blend of purified manoproteins and gum arabic. So they can sometimes work side by side. And it's often used mainly for its colloidal stability impacts. But at the same time, it does improve mouthfeel, mid-palate fullness, balance, length, and body. And so I'll let Yonder talk about their experience.
All right, so yeah, definitely the impact both in mouthfeel and aroma without adding woody or oaky characters that tannin may impart. The control that we used for this, I would say, is like exactly what we're going for. There was nothing wrong with this control. I remember tasting this very, very clearly, and the control was intense citrus aroma, tropical notes, a nice long finish. I was thinking, there's nothing wrong with this. We don't need to add anything. But then when we tasted the Final Touch Tonic, my notes were that it definitely increased the aroma intensity, more citrus notes shining through. You started to be able to pinpoint all of these citrus notes, like the lemon, the grapefruit, the lime peel. Tropical notes brightened up quite a bit, but it softened some of the tartness. The mouthfeel had a bit more weight to it and it felt quite a bit warmer, like an increased perception of alcohol. I don't know if that's a thing or not, but it definitely felt boozier. The Ultimate Soft, definitely a style driver. It went in one direction, and that could be kind of like Ella was saying, all the different factors. It could be the yeast. Like it went in one direction, very lemon forward. But even though it was like screaming lemon, it was really balanced and kind of soft and rounded out, similar to the Final Touch Tonic. But for application, enhancing the mouthfeel without the astringency of tannin, and creates a bit more texture and definitely tweaking your aroma profile. But it's nice to have in your back pocket pre-packaging. It's a quick addition that you can make. And we've definitely been in situations where it's like, oh no, this batch is a little lackluster. We got to move. We're canning in like 2 days. Like, what are we going to do? Like this would be great to have on hand. Yeah.
Awesome. Emily, do we have any questions for?
Yeah, we do. There's one that was holdover from the tannins that's asking if there's a max legal amount of tannins to add.
That's a good question. I feel like it's It's jogging my memory for some reason. Please feel free to follow up with me via email, which will be on the last slide, because I believe it's only for a certain class of tannins, but I can definitely look into that.
Okay, and then Anna is asking the Yonder team if you produce any sparkling ciders, might be interesting to see mana proteins in combination with that matrix.
Not at the moment. No, no sparkling.
Not yet.
Not yet.
And I think something to be cautious of when using mana proteins for like a sparkling cider, like a bottle conditioned sparkling cider, is there are specialized mana proteins for that application. So be sure when you're considering using mana proteins for bottle conditioned cider, it goes in with the typically the secondary fermentation ingredients instead of the dosage at the end.
I don't see any more questions, but people may be typing.
Awesome. Well, we'll just move to the thanks slide. But yeah, thank you for having us. This was lovely. And Arturo and I go way back. We went to college together. Well, I was an undergrad. He was a grad student in the winemaking program at Davis. So it was really cool to get to reconnect and collaborate on this project together.
And I want to say a huge thank you. I know it took a lot of preparation time for both of you, especially Yonder. Thank you so much for spending the time and giving us the tasting notes, doing all the trials. This is fascinating. And I don't know if I've seen this many people on one of our Zoom events in a while. So I'm really excited to see the passion and excitement. There's a ton of people who are watching recorded, and the interactions were really great. I think the last question I'm seeing, just people saying thank you. Lots of people saying thank you.
I just want to say something. Thank you for having us. We learned a lot. Like we learned a lot, and I think that we could, maybe not right now, but I think we could apply some of these things to our program in the future. So Ella, thank you for teaching us so much.
Of course. Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys soon, and I wish I could have been there in person.
Us too.
Yeah.